In the previous lesson, we introduced the concept of the English legal system, and what we're going to do in this lesson is talk about the nature of law more generally, because we can't understand the structure and the processes of the English legal system without trying to understand what it actually is to call something law. Now, we're going to try and just take an overview to that question, being very reticent of the fact that we are going to be covering this in far more detail when we look at the philosophical dimensions of law in our series on jurisprudence. Because essentially, the questions that we're asking in the series on jurisprudence relates to this kind of topic. What is law? What does it mean to call something law? This lesson is just going to try and give us a bit more of a working definition of the kind of things that we're talking about, the idea of law, the nature of enforcement of legal principles. So we're going to examine and look at the nature of law and the idea that law can be representative of a collection of rules. And in doing so, we're going to try and come to some kind of definition of law, making it very clear that we are talking about the way in which law is operationalized within society to reflect often morality or some kind of societal condition, and to try and generally understand what the purpose of law is within the broader construct of society itself. Now, according to Robertson from 2006, they describe law as a set of rules that are created and are enforceable by social or governmental institutions to regulate behavior. That is considered to be a generalized, often quite uncontroversial definition of what law is. It's a set of rules, and that we create these rules to be enforceable. They are enforceable by some way through societal or governmental institutions, i.e. a judiciary or a court, and the purpose of them is to regulate behavior, to regulate societal behavior. And what this essentially does is define law as a special kind of rule, a collection of rules. And if we were to talk about the kind of rules that they have certain special characteristics and features attached to them. So then what are rules? Well, if we understand and we try and understand law through the lens of rules and the idea that law is just considered and can be just considered to be a collection of rules, we suggest that rules, therefore, are general principles which are said to be enforceable in some way. So they are enforceable through society, in the case of a sort of general rule of society, or they are more enforceable through the specific institution that said rules are supposed to govern. So, for example, the offside rule in football is a rule that is applicable to the sport of football. The offside rule is not something that is operationalized and something that is enforceable to broader society. It is something that is enforceable specifically, and it only makes sense to be enforceable specifically within the context of football, or if you're American soccer. And so, as a result of which, these are ideas of rules which are regulated internally within the sport itself. And then so when we take this a level higher, we talk about the level of society as a whole, we represent the rules that govern said society, and we define that as law. And we define laws as the kind of collection of rules which govern society in the same way that rules in football govern the sport of football itself. So, for example, everyday societal issues such as buying a house, getting married or divorced, purchasing from a shop, business and commerce, regulating crime, they are all done through and under the auspices of a certain collection of societal rules, and we call these rules law. And that is how we understand law to what it means in this context. However, Robertson also makes a reference to this idea of enforceability through government institutions. Well, what do we mean when we talk about the enforcement of rules and the enforcement of law? So how is it the case that law is enforced? Well, the enforcement of law is actually one of the main things that you study as a law student or as a future lawyer. There is often a violation of law, or there may be a dispute arising out of legal principles, and so the enforcement of your personal rights or the enforcement of a state right to prosecute, for example, might be what is constitutive of the enforcement of law, the enforcement of rules. And given that we can describe law potentially as a mechanism for social control, a little bit like what Robertson said in 2006. The formal mechanism for enforcement of such rules will also exist. So law can be enforced in a number of different ways, depending on the type of law that we are talking about. Now, in the next lesson, what we're going to do is examine the distinction and the delineation between the civil and the criminal law. But there is a certain differentiation in terms of enforceability between those two areas. For the most part, you'll be studying the enforcement and interpretation of law through the structure of courts, the judiciary. And this is sort of the government institution that represents an enforcement mechanism for that, for laws which are alleged to have been broken, to be violated, or disputes between individuals as to their private rights within a legal system. Now, like I said just then, courts represent part of the state judiciary, a branch of the government which is tasked with the job of enforcing and interpreting laws which are passed. And so they also represent a mechanism by which new law is created through the common law, through the fact that a court decision on a particular fact may be influential for future decisions on similar facts, for example. And so as a result of this, we can see that the enforcement of rules relates to this idea of a judicial enforcement of rules, the sort of mechanizing of enforcement through judiciary and through the establishment of the common law, and also through other kinds of judicial functions like tribunals, and you also have things like alternative dispute resolution, for example. So when we talk about the difference between rules in the context of sport and laws in the context of the state, rules have an obligation to be followed. There is obviously an obligation if you're playing football to follow the rules within the confines of the sport of football. But if you do not follow those rules, then the consequences of that are limited to your playing of football. They're not limited to the state as a whole. Because if you break the law, you will be penalized. There will be penalties, including fines, there may be injunctions, and there may even be prison time. And so there is also an obligation to follow the law by everyone. Everybody has to follow the law. Compare this, of course, to the context of sport, where only those who are playing the game have an obligation to follow the rules of said game. It's almost like the rules of society are the laws that everybody has to follow. So this is how we understand a basic principle of the rule of law, in fact. The idea that nobody is above the law. There is equality before the law. These are things that we're going to talk about in a future lesson in both this series on the English legal system and also in the series on public law.